Guatemala, 1985. A country caught in a civil war between the government and communist guerrillas. In the outlying villages, the government appoints civil patrollers, an armed militia made up of civilians. Everyone must serve 1 day a week. The government provides guns, but no training. It instructs the militia to patrol for communist rebels, but nobody patrols the militia. For hungry young journalists, 1985 was an exciting and dangerous time to be in Guatemala. Freelance American journalist Nick Blake and photographer Griffith Davis underestimated that danger. In their pursuit of a story, they headed into a remote part of the country and vanished. Nick Blake's brother Randy did all he could to uncover what happened.
My brother disappeared in March of '85. I'd been doing requests with the State Department and 4 or 5 other federal agencies who would be in a position to know things, such as the CIA and the National Security Agency and others for ever since, probably 1987.
Randy Blake found only dead ends. Then, a year and a half into his search, he heard an unconfirmed story from an American teacher in a village in Guatemala.
We would go to little fiestas with them and so forth, and you got to know them, and they would talk about the gringos that got killed by the Civil Patrol.
Piecing together the details, the teacher believed the Civil Patrol shot the journalists in 1985. A ravine became their makeshift grave. The Blake family kept pressure on the U.S. and Guatemalan governments to find Nick. To hide the crime, the Civil Patrol retrieved the skeletons and burned them in a raging bonfire. The flames split and shattered the bones beyond all recognition, or at least that's what the patrollers thought. But the Blake family persisted. The patrollers were pressured into sending the remains to the United States. They arrived in 1990, but an analysis uncovered a deception. The crate did not contain human remains. Convinced they had exposed a cover-up, the Blakes and U.S. authorities demanded the truth. Felipe Alva, the regional commander of the Guatemalan Civil Patrol, refused to talk about the incident until the Blakes offered an incentive.
And he was going to be offered a $10,000 reward. And so, but it was going to be paid to him in allotments as he performed along the job.
Enticed by the offer, Alva agreed to send the real remains to the U.S. so long as the family promised not to prosecute.
He came out with a partial unearthing of remains from the site, and he brought them back in 2 boxes, very curious things. They were essentially little caskets, mini caskets, square pine boxes that were velvet lined. And it was the strangest thing because they had dirt in them from the site with little bone chips salted throughout them and so forth, because that's essentially what was remained in my brother and his friend.
The grim homecoming occurred without ceremony at a loading dock behind the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The unmarked remains had traveled over 3,000 miles to get there. Navigating through a maze of deception and lies. But more work lay ahead before the Blakes could put their loved one to rest and find the closure they sought. This time they had to be certain the bones in the crates were truly Nick's and Griffith's. For the delicate task of identifying the remains, they pinned their hopes on forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley. When the crates arrived, they were x-rayed to see if they required special handling to avoid damage. They contained no surprises. Mostly soil, ash, roots, and bits of bone. Then Owsley and his team sorted the bones. It was immediately apparent the remains were human. They also found a duplication of parts and a color difference. Owsley was certain these were the remains of two people. Out of 150 pounds of dirt and debris, they recovered about 2 pounds of incinerated bone. The largest of the more than 1,600 fragments was just 3 inches long. But Owsley was fortunate. Some of the fragments came from the occipital protuberance at the back of the skull. The large size of the specimens indicated both were male. But they could have been almost any two men. Then he found a nickel-sized piece of bone that made all the difference. It was a fragment that fits in the forehead and forms a ridge or crest for the sinuses inside the skull. It's called the frontal crest.
Now this is a really unusual configuration of the frontal crest here. Usually this is a solid, prominent ridge, but in a small percentage of the population you can get a double ridge morphology like that. So we had this piece, and based on that, I had a microfilm of an X-ray that was taken of Griffith Davis.
Owsley compared the crest with an X-ray of Davis's head taken after a car accident. The unusual structure of the bone fragment from Guatemala matched the X-ray. But did that prove the fragment came from Davis's skull? Not unless Owsley could first prove that its structure was truly rare. To see how often the crest structure occurred in the general population, Owsley referred to a group of skeletons known as the Terry collection. The more than 1,600 skeletons of the Terry collection were donated for medical research from the 1920s to the 1940s. They represent a cross-section of the population. The medical history of each individual is part of the record. Owsley used the Terry collection to see what percentage of the population shared Davis's frontal crest structure. If only a few people had that bone configuration, and if it was shared by the Guatemala sample and Davis, then Owsley could reasonably conclude the bones could belong to Davis.
If you look at this cranial vault, for instance, one of the things that you've got is here's the cribriform plate, foramen cecum, and then you've got this standard type of frontal crest. And it's a very prominent ridge that occurs in 88% of white males. Now, in contrast, you see how you've got, again, the same structure, but now we've got a double ridge and a groove. This is the type that we see in Griffith Davis's cranium. This occurs 9% of the time.
Davis and the remains from Guatemala shared the same rare anatomical feature. Owsley felt confident the skull fragments could belong to Davis. But were the remaining bones Nick Blake's? The limited sample enabled Owsley to perform only one more test, determining the relative age of the bodies. For this, he relied on the sutures in the skulls. In the specimen that Owsley thought to be Griffith Davis, the sutures showed advanced closure, suggesting a man in his 30s. The sutures on the other remains were still open, indicating a younger man.
So that helped differentiate. The two males were differing in age by about 11 years. And this helped me determine that this was the older person.
At the time of his death, Griffith Davis was 38. Nick Blake was 27. Owsley's calculation was right on the mark. To Randy Blake, Owsley's identification was encouraging, but naggingly inconclusive. If these bones were truly the remains of his brother, he needed to be absolutely sure. As long as a shadow of doubt persisted, the Blakes could not give up their search. But Owsley had reached his limit. He could go no further without more remains.
We said to ourselves, it's probably Nick, but darn it, we want to get up to that site and we want to determine definitely that this is Nick, and let's just make a trip down there. We've got an opportunity.
Going to Guatemala was the only choice the Blakes had if they wanted to honor their brother. But Owsley had to accompany them. Only he could provide the assurance the Blakes had waited so long for. Together, they would retrace the final steps of Nicholas Blake and Griffith Davis. With forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley's help, Randy Blake felt he was close to finding his brother. He knew that the only way to claim Nick's remains was to retrieve them himself. Randy, his brother Sam, Owsley, and a colleague made the trip to Guatemala in June 1992. There, they met Regional Civil Patrol Commander Felipe Alva. He took them to the remote mountain location of the remains. But Owsley wasn't buying it.
I take my trowel and do a little scraping. I cut down to about 15 centimeters, and I come up and say, this is the wrong site. I say there's not enough ash, there's no bone fragments here, there's none of the red soil that I'm looking for. I just looked at this, all of this, 2 containers a couple months before, and there's none of the roots that were found in any of that.
Then, sheepishly, Alva's assistant reached under a log and removed a green plastic bag that contained a handful of human bone fragments and some soil.
And in this 8 ounces of soil, it's got the right color, it's got the charcoal, it's got root fragments. And I say, this is from the right site. And he says, I got it right here.
The assistant told them these were the last of the remains. The Americans demanded to see where they came from.
We went back to our little hotel in Neiba, and we basically grilled Felipe Alva for 3 hours that night with a Guatemalan colonel, U.S. Embassy defense attaché, U.S. Army colonel, a couple of other people in the room, and basically said him and said, Alva, you lied to us.
Under duress, Felipe Alva agreed to take the team to a site he swore was the actual location of the remains. When they arrived 2 days later, Owsley looked it over with a skeptic's eye.
We could see the indentation where the soil had been taken out. We worked it around the perimeters, and we found a lot of things. One of the things we found lots of was metal. Well, here's part of an eyeglass frame, part of the eyeglass piece in the frame, and it's a circular type of pattern. And it's just one of the things that when we first picked it up, one of the brothers of this man said, that looks like his glasses. So we knew that we were in a very significant spot.
Now certain they had the right spot, the team collected all they could and headed home.
It was almost like tailor-made for Doug Owsley. I mean, it was so perfect because we were so lucky to have him in that one day, because clearly a deception was planned and was being executed, clearly. And he just totally blew it out of the water by being there and allowed us to have the ammunition to get this guy to come clean.
Among the bones Doug Owsley carried back with him were fragments of a shattered jawbone. They still held some of the teeth and all the roots. They would enable him to make a direct comparison to Blake's dental records.
From the dental records that we had of him in life, we knew that he had impacted third molars. And they had come in at an angle where the third molar had bumped into the second and had gotten locked up. And so what it had actually done is wore a contact or a wear facet into the side of the second molar. And it had a very distinctive root associated with it.
From the shape of the teeth and roots, Owsley was able to positively identify Nick Blake. For the Blake family, it marked the end of a grueling, emotional ordeal. Now they could grieve Nick's loss and give his remains a proper burial.
That meant everything, to repatriate his remains and bring them back and bury them in a cemetery and give them a grave marker, which we did.
Not enough remains of Blake or Davis were recovered to confirm they were shot. For the Blakes and the Davises, that was no longer important. Bringing Nick and Griffith home was enough.